I'm benefiting from our time in the book of Esther. I'm really enjoying reading up around it and preparing for these meetings. I hope that you two are. Hope that we can see something of how God works, as we're saying in the title of this series, behind the scene. And what I want to do this evening is to go back to the passage we were looking at last week, briefly, which was chapter 2, verses 1 to 18, where the writer tells us of a demeaning contest. Now, just to remind us of the story in those verses, we saw there, first of all, the new proposal at the start of the chapter that a new queen be found for miserable King Xerxes, that a search be made for a beautiful young women of all beautiful young women in the empire, and for them to undergo a year of beauty treatments and other preparations in order to spend a night with the king. That's the proposal, which, as we read, seems good to the king. And then the writer introduces us to two new characters who are going to take center stage in the book. Two Jews, Mordecai and his orphaned cousin Esther, who just happens to be young and beautiful. Now, not only does Esther win over the king's eunuch, she also wins over the king himself, as we saw in the latter part of the chapter, who makes her his new queen. Now, there we paused last week, and we spent a little bit of time, if you were here last week, you might remember, talking about the significance of all this for us. And we mentioned the fact that interpreters over the years have disagreed, what's exactly going on here. Now, on one level, we said, we can see that a story like this might speak to us about the danger of being exploited by the world. That's one way of looking at the story in chapter 2. So this is the perspective which says, poor Mordecai and Esther, they find themselves caught up in a situation that's not of their own doing. They're exiles, they're living under the exploitative power of the empire. They're having to negotiate as best as they can what it means to belong to God and yet be part of the difficult world in which they live. And if we want to spiritualize the story for a moment, we could say this is a world which forces us to use its beauty treatments, just as Esther had to use those beauty treatments, so that we can measure up to its standards of what counts. So this story that we saw last week may speak to us about the danger of being exploited by the world. And then we said, however, on another level, a story like this might speak to us about the danger of being assimilated into the world. So this is the perspective which says that Mordecai and Esther, these two Jews, they've simply absorbed themselves into the culture of the empire. They're still in Persia when they could have gone home. They're named after pagan gods. They keep quiet about their Jewish identity. Mordecai is prepared to risk the life of his beautiful cousin in what amounts to a glorified sex contest. She's prepared not only to break several of God's laws in order to take part in that process, but also to sleep with someone who's not her husband and then to marry a man outside the faith. Apart from that, everything's great. And again, if we want to spiritualize for a moment, this is where we, sometimes as people of faith, happily avail ourselves of the beauty treatments that are on offer in the world so that we can blend in and be a comfortable part of what's going on. So we asked the question last week, are Esther and Mordecai heroes or villains? Is this a case of exploitation or assimilation? And we're simply not told. We're not told. There's no line which says, and so Esther did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And there's no line which says, lo, the Lord was with Esther and he prospered her. But one of the geniuses of this book is that the writer doesn't tell us. And the story is told in such a way that the motivations of the character almost seem deliberately to be kept from us. And that's brilliant storytelling because it kind of draws us in. The book is written in a way that obliges us to get involved and to ask those sorts of questions. And therefore it becomes maybe applicable in multiple different circumstances, if I can put it that way. And perhaps at the end of the day, it's also a way of saying, you know, life actually, when push comes to shove, life actually is a lot more messy than we might imagine. It's not necessarily at the end of the day a simple choice between these two options. Because, as I suggested towards the end of last week, whether it's a case of exploitation or assimilation or a complicated mix of the two, what the writer shows us in the book of Esther is that we can take comfort from the fact that God is at work in the world, albeit sometimes unseen. In other words, both apply in different ways at different times. Yes, we know as God's people that living in the world brings with it the danger of being exploited. And yes, living in the world brings with it the danger of being assimilated. But the great comfort of the book of Esther is that either way, by the time we get to the end of the book, we can be assured that God is still at work in the world, even at those times when he feels most absent. The author, I think, is skillfully describing a morally ambiguous, complex situation, because actually that's the way real life often is in this fallen world. We sometimes have a tendency, I think, to want to flatten our Bible characters out into good or bad, you know, saint or sinner, one side or the other. But they're not like that. The Bible characters aren't like that. And if we're honest, we're not like that. I'm not like that. And in one sense, it doesn't matter, because it all comes together in an even deeper story of God's grace. The book of Esther tells us that God's grace is bigger than any exploitation we might experience at the hands of the world, and it's bigger than any challenges we might face or any compromises we might make along the way, wittingly or unwittingly. In that sense, there are no beauty treatments that we can use to commend ourselves to our great bridegroom. He doesn't force us to do so, and we don't need to do so either, because as the Apostle Paul tells us in Ephesians 5, Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. What the book of Esther tells us, that whether we've compromised or been exploited, whether we've been assimilated into the culture of the world or broken by what's happened to us in the world, God will make all things right. If not now, then one day. And as I hope we'll see, that message continues to play out in the rest of the book. So that's a little recap on what we were doing last week, and just kind of rounding off, at least I think, how I would want to try to understand how some of the threads are coming together in the book. So let's move on to this evening's passage, which is chapter 2, verse 19 to the end of chapter 3, verse 15, which we're looking at under this heading of a deadly conspiracy. So go and look at this again in three movements. And we begin in chapter 2, verses 19 to 23 with a foiled plot. So once again, as I did last week, I'm going to walk us through the story, just commenting every so often on what's going on. So let's see how the section starts in verse 19. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now, we're not sure what this second assembly of virgins is all about. You remember there's a gathering of virgins to Susa, and now it looks like there's a second assembly. It almost certainly refers to a gathering of a next batch of potential girls for Xerxes. Now, it's not now that he and Esther are married, he suddenly becomes a one-woman man. It's not the kind of man that Xerxes is. This is almost certainly another batch of girls. But the writer uses the moment to bring us back to Mordecai, who we're told is sitting at the king's gate. Now, to sit at the king's gate at this time is to have some sort of position in government. He's a civil servant of some sort, though we're not told how junior or how senior he is. This king's gate that's mentioned, the foundations of the gate of Susa have been excavated. It was built by King Darius. There's a kind of an impression of it. It's measured about 36 by about 19 meters with a central hall leading into the royal compound of Susa with two adjoining rectangular rooms. And this basically is where Mordecai works. It's like the portcullis house of Westminster. Anyway, verse 20 brings us back to Esther. We read there, but Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. Now, again, the writer reminds us here what he's told us earlier in the chapter, that Esther has kept her nationality and identity a secret so far. Now, if we didn't know the story, as a first-time reader, we might think, why is the writer telling us this again? Of course, we're being set up for a moment later in the story when Esther will need to declare her identity. But for the moment, it's being kept quiet. It's a secret. But meanwhile, comes the mention of an assassination plot against the king in verses 21 to 23. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh sound like sort of characters from a Disney cartoon, don't they? Like a Lion King or something like that. Two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So, a few things going on here. The plot fits very well with what we know of ancient history. It wasn't at all unheard of for assassination plots to be carried out by the king's own security detail. Because they were the guys, obviously, who were close to the king, who were given the job of protecting the king. Who better to put a knife in it? And actually, Xerxes would eventually successfully be assassinated in 465 in his bed. For the moment, this plot against him is foiled, and it's Mordecai who discovers it. But we're not told how he heard about it, but he's in the king's gate. These guys are guarding the doors in the king's gate, so he overhears something, and he reports it. And now, for the first time, but not the last time in the story, Esther's position in the palace becomes significant. So she's in the palace. Mordecai tells Esther, as we discover as we go on, they're communicating through an intermediary or intermediaries, but Mordecai communicates somehow to Esther. Esther tells the king, giving Mordecai the credit for it. That then leads to the trial. The plotters are executed in standard grisly Persian fashion by being impaled on poles. And then what happened, including the name of the person who discovered the plot, is written down in the official records. And we'll need to remember that. We'll need to log that away because that will become important a couple of chapters down the line. So it's written down in the official records of Persia. And who is ever going to want to read those? Well, keep that thought. Now, notice that Mordecai he doesn't receive any recognition or reward. That was unusual. Persian kings loved to reward loyal subjects. It was a way of getting everyone on your side. That doesn't happen here. But, that's often how it is when you live in the world. You do good stuff. You don't always get acknowledged for it. But if we have eyes to see God at work in the book, two of his people are in place. Regardless of how compromised they are or how assimilated they might be, two of his people are in place. One has been made a queen in the king's palace, and the other is a civil servant, albeit unrecognized at the moment, but a civil servant in the king's service. So a foiled plot. And that brings us to chapter 3, verses 1 to 4, with a new promotion. So chapter 3 begins with the phrase, after these events. Now, we assume that this refers to the foiling of the assassination plot, although we're not told how long after. But I suspect that original hearers of this story, or readers of this story, would think after these events, Mordecai is going to get honored, because that would be the natural progression from where we were. Now, someone is honored, but it's not Mordecai. What we discover later on in the chapter, in verse 7, is that it's now about 5 years since Esther was made queen. So some time has passed between Esther becoming queen and the events that are about to be described. We don't always understand that because of the way the chapters flow. But anyway, given Mordecai's part in exposing this plot, we might expect the king to reward him, as I say. Instead, though, someone else is promoted. So look at verses 1 and 2. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. So Haman is promoted to head of government, effectively second in command to the king. The king had commanded for the people to honor him, which they did, except, we're told, for Mordecai. Now, as it happens, there's nothing in the scriptures that would forbid Mordecai from showing respect to Haman. Kneeling down was a mark of respect for a person in a senior position. So we might want to know, well, what's going on here? Is Mordecai just being obstinate here, or is this a courageous stand? Was it a commendable stand for the right, or was it sheer rudeness? Was it jealousy that Haman was promoted and he wasn't? What's going on here? Now, again, we're not told. We're not told. And even Mordecai's colleagues are puzzled, as we see in verses 3 and 4. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command? Day after day, we have the sense that they were pestering him constantly about this. Day after day, they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it. So it looks as if Haman himself hasn't noticed that Mordecai isn't doing this. So they have to tell Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. For he had told them he was a Jew. Now, he's asked repeatedly why he didn't show respect to Haman, and he refuses to say. They then check in with Haman about it. And here, I think we probably get some insight into why Mordecai won't bow down to Haman. The reason isn't because Haman is being set up as a god. The reason is that Mordecai is identified as a Jew, and Haman is identified as an Agagite. And you're all going, of course, that explains everything. But this is where we have to fill in a little bit of history, a little bit of history for us. So we start by going back to 1 Samuel chapter 15. Now, Agag was the Amalekite king in the time of Saul, whose life Saul spared when he'd been ordered to execute him. And that actually ended up costing Saul his position as king. Samuel comes along and does the job for him, but Saul loses the kingship. So that's Agag, the king of the Amalekites. So we read in 1 Samuel 15, verses 1 to 2. This is what the Lord Almighty says. This is the start of the chapter. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. That's the command that's given to Saul. Now, what they did to Israel when they waylaid them, when they came up from Egypt, because we've gone through Exodus recently, you might remember the story in Exodus 17, which James preached on at the time, where the Amalekites attacked the people of Israel when they're in the wilderness on their way to Sinai. So they're fresh out of the Red Sea. They're wandering through the wilderness. They've got the manna in chapter 16, and they've got the water in chapter 17. And then suddenly the Amalekites, out of nowhere, the Amalekites attacked them. It was an unprovoked attack. And if you remember the story, the Lord helped them defeat the Amalekites on that occasion with a little help from Aaron and Hur holding aloft Moses' arms. So that's the Amalekites back in Exodus 17. But we read at the end of that chapter, so Exodus 17, these words in verses 14 to 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered. Make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Moses built an altar and called it, the Lord is my banner. He said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. Right back in Exodus 17. And then that's repeated through Moses to the people later on in Deuteronomy 25. So this is now 40 years later, when Moses is addressing the people in the plains of Moab before they go into the land. Remember, he says, what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. So we have a line which goes from Exodus 17 to Deuteronomy 25 to 1 Samuel 15 to Esther. Now, you might recall from Esther chapter 2, verse 5, that Mordecai is identified as being from the tribe of Benjamin, from whom came King Saul. And Mordecai has someone in his family tree called Kish, who, well, that Kish was the name of the father of Saul. So it was Saul, back in the day, who failed to remove Agag, the king of the Amalekites, all those centuries before. And now, here is a son of Saul and a son of Agag going head to head once again. So what we have here in the book of Esther is a long-standing hostility, which goes right back to the very early days of the history of Israel, immediately after the Exodus. And God's reminding them as they go into the promised land, don't forget those Amalekites, sort them out. And then later on, with in the time of Samuel, saying to Saul, the Amalekites. And now here it is resurfacing 5 centuries later in Susa. So that is some of the background to this. Someone described it a little bit like maybe a Jewish person who maybe doesn't massively take their Judaism seriously, but maybe at some point they meet a Nazi or a Nazi sympathizer, and what happens is that kind of awakes that kind of latent ancient hostility. There's something similar going on here. So Mordecai, from the tribe of Benjamin, a son of Saul, will not bow down to Haman, the Agagite, a son of Amalek. And that leads into the next part of the story, a hateful plan. And this takes us from verse 5 through to the end of the chapter. Now, I've got some headings for this section, which I borrowed from a book on Esther by Christopher Ash, which I think helpfully describe the different facets of Haman's hatred. First of all, we see in verses 5 and 6 that it is a murderous hatred. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Now, notice, first of all, that he's enraged. I think it might be the same word that's used of the king back in chapter 1, when Vashti went come and parade herself. So, like the king, he has a fragile ego which is easily angered. And just as chapter 1 saw an acceleration in action, so the dial kind of gets turned up here too. As soon as Haman learns who Mordecai is, he determines to kill not just Mordecai, but all of Mordecai's people. And then we see in verse 7 that it's a superstitious hatred. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select the day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Now, pur comes from the word meaning lot or fate. What happens is that a die or a couple of dice of some kind were rolled in order to allow fate to decide the best date, the most auspicious date for the genocide to take place. That's what's going on here in verse 7. Kind of leave it in the lap of the gods, kind of thing. Now, we know that casting lots is also carried out by people of faith, but here, of course, it's out of ungodly superstition, and the sense is almost certainly that Haman is using diviners here. And we're given the date on which the lot was cast. And what this tells us is that we are now 12 years into the reign of Xerxes. It's about 9 years or so since the story began with those 3 parties. It's about 5 years or so since Esther became queen. The lot is cast in the first month of the year, and it just so happens to come up with the day in the 12th month, which gives nearly a whole year. It's a murderous hatred, it's a superstitious hatred, and it's a deceitful hatred. Because what we get here is Haman's cleverly persuasive speech to Xerxes. And like a lot of clever deception, it's a mixture of truth, half-truth, and downright lies. So let's listen to what he says in verses 8 and 9. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. Now, he starts off truthfully enough with the fact that there is a certain people dispersed among the peoples of all the provinces of your kingdom. That's true. Notice he doesn't name them. He goes on to say, who keep themselves separate. Well, do they? I mean, sort of, but not really, or not in the dangerous way that Haman seems to be implying. I mean, one of them is queen, for starters, and at least another one of them is a civil servant. That's hardly keeping themselves separate. And then their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. Well, again, sort of. But no, not really, at least not in this book. We don't have any Jewish practices that are described in this book. Aside from not showing respect to Haman, Mordecai gives every appearance of being a law-abiding citizen. He'd even foiled the plot to kill the king. So like Satan, the father of lies, Haman plays fast and loose with the truth. And on top of that, his lies are accompanied with the promise of recompense. He's clearly a wealthy man. According to scholars, the bribe he offers Xerxes here is equivalent to 60% of the entire revenue of the empire. Now, it's not clear how he expects to pay it. Perhaps it's an over-the-top gesture. Perhaps he really is that rich. Perhaps he's expecting to recoup that amount of money from plundering the Jews. So he's basically promising that from all the plunder, this is what will come into the king's treasury, which would have been very attractive to Xerxes. He was maybe not as well off at this time as he had been earlier on in his reign. So how will the king respond? Well, verse 10 and 11 tell us. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, just in case we've forgotten about that, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. Now notice, as I said, that the writer reminds us that Haman is an Agagite and that he's an enemy of the Jews, though Xerxes doesn't know of this long-standing feud that goes back centuries. Haman hasn't named the people. Xerxes hasn't asked. But the king's signet ring gives Haman the right to act with the king's authority and enables him to seal documents with the king's seal. And so we finish the chapter with a picture of a comprehensive hatred. Because verses 12 to 14 reinforce just the all-embracing nature of this terrible decree. Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and men, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. It was written by the king's secretaries in every language of the empire, just as the edict about Vashti was in chapter 1. And dispatches are sent by the famous Persian royal mail system, just as it was in chapter 1. And the order is not only to destroy the Jews, and not only to kill the Jews, but to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jews, which is about as comprehensive as you can get. None are to escape, young and old, women and children. And those who do the killing are also authorized to plunder the Jews. And the day is given, the 13th day, 12th month, the month of Adar. Now, we're not told, though the first readers would probably pick it up, that the date on which Haman's decree goes out happens to be the day before Passover. So that's the decree when it goes out. Passover, as we know, celebrated the time when centuries before, God had rescued the people from the power of Pharaoh in Egypt. Would he do it again? Did the people wonder whether God would do it again, or were they not even celebrating Passover at this point? Meanwhile, let's spot how the chapter ends in verse 15. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. And if we wanted another heading for what's going on here, we might think of this as a callous hatred. Government is thrown into chaos. People are scratching their heads. What's this all about? Meanwhile, Xerxes and Haman are having a beer. So there we go. I know I spent a long time, but it's a long chapter. But there's the deadly conspiracy. It sets us up for the rest of the book. Foil plot, a new promotion, and a hateful plan. Again, briefly, what are we to make of this? Well, I have two thoughts. We might come back to this next week as well, but I have two brief thoughts for us as we close. First of all is the hostility we experience, or we might experience as God's people. We said in our first session that it's helpful to understand that the Jews at this time were the old covenant people of God. It's a religious label, not just an ethnic label. The New Testament makes it clear that Christians are heirs of the old covenant people of God. So when we read Jew in the book of Esther, we could add in our heads, that is, a member of the covenant people of God. So this hatred of God's people in ancient Persia might well extend to hatred of God's people in other times and places. In fact, as we saw, it began right back in Exodus 17 with an unprovoked attack. There is an underlying hatred for God in this world that will often express itself in hostility to his people. We do see that again and again and again and again in Scripture. It goes back not just to Exodus 17, but even further back than that. In fact, right the way back to Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis, and right the way forward to the dragon and God's people in the book of Revelation. It is an ancient, murderous, superstitious, deceitful, comprehensive, callous hatred. Now, how this hostility is experienced by God's people varies from time to time, from place to place. We have to acknowledge that. We don't face physical or life-threatening persecution in our own country, but we know that many around the world do. Perhaps our time will come one day. But we may still face a cold shoulder or a sneer. Surely you don't believe that Stone Age nonsense in this day and age, do you? And with it, that kind of underlying, I don't even know what to call it, but just a sneer, really. And there's perhaps some comfort that we can draw a line through Scripture to Jesus himself. And that as Christians, we can follow his pattern. But the passage also speaks to us about the deliverance we need. Chapter 3 ends with this sentence of death hanging over the Jews, the people of God. What will happen? Will they be saved? How will they be saved? Will God do it again? Will there be another Passover type situation? Interestingly, I think we can compare and contrast the story of Esther with the story of Joseph and the story of Exodus. The story of Joseph illustrates how God can be at work through human decision-making and apparent wrong turns and other people's malice. But at the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph says to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. We have no such line in the book of Esther. The Exodus story shows how God powerfully, miraculously delivers his people from slavery in Egypt and how he brings judgment on those who oppress his people. But we have no displays of God's power in that sense in the book of Esther. And yet deliverance still comes. And that, I think, and hope is a great comfort to us. Because here's a book which describes the tyrannies of a world empire with self-indulgence of all sorts going on, sexual exploitation and abuse of women, planned genocide and slaughter. That's the book of Esther. And then it invites us to consider that God is somehow involved in this world, in all its wickedness, and notwithstanding even the compromise of his people in these situations. And it tells us that deliverance will come. And we know, don't we, that we had a sentence of death hanging over us that we would never have been able to escape were it not that one stood in our place and took the punishment that we deserve. As the Apostle Paul says, for it is by grace you've been saved through faith, and it's not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Amen.